Welcome to Credible Sources. He was a father, a husband, a brother. Today, the Medford family are grieving. They have lost their relative at a public institution, and they believe it is because of neglect. Lynn Medford sat down with us recently. Here is her story.
Imagine walking into a hospital room and finding your father or finding your relative hung over, dead. It was obvious that he was dead for a couple of hours. Imagine being told that he was calling for help. The nurses were ignoring his cry. The patients in his room was giving him aid in an institution where my father believed in. I was taking him to a private hospital on the day he was admitted, and he turned me around. He stood up in the seat of my car and he said, "Take me to the public hospital," because he believed in the public system. And this is what became of him, because he believed in the public system. When we did the ultrasound at the private hospital, we could have continued and had to have the CT scan done as well to have him get an immediate response. But he believed in a public system that failed him. He sat there for 2 days. He was not looked at by a doctor. I prayed for someone to prove me wrong, that they were standing there looking at my father and I wasn't sitting there at my father's side. They did not feed him. The medical report said he was fed a bland diet. No one looked at my father. I tended to my father when they gave him animal and he was in a terrible state on the bed. I went to a nurse. I said, "Nurse, no one is looking at my father. Can I help?" She told me where to get the material to change him and diaper and stuff, and I did that. I did that in the emergency room. No one was looking at my father. My father was, if anyone has gotten a broken mirror, car mirror, you would have at some point had some business done with the mirror man. The mirror man was my father. He was a public servant. He believed in serving people, and I would say, he believed in the public system, the public hospital. This was unjust. We need answers. We need accountability. That's the word for today, accountability. And we need people we need an institution, a hospital that is hospitable. They have no hospitality there. They have no empathy. The emergency room, the way you speak to someone, the words that you choose to use on a sick person can determine if how they recover. But they have none of that. Training, proper training. But again, accountability. A life has been lost, and it's not the only one. But I will make sure that this doesn't go under the table like others. My experience at the Georgetown Public Hospital was one of horror, and definitely something that should ignite some kind of change at that institution. On the 7th of November, on the afternoon of the 7th of November, I took my father, Leon Medford, to the emergency room at Georgetown Public Hospital. He was complaining of back pains, of a prior surgery. That's what we thought it was. But obviously you would go to an institution to find out what really was causing the ailment. As we arrived at the emergency room, he was triaged and he was taken to the trauma room. From that afternoon to 4 a.m., my father was not looked at. He was given painkillers, and he was checked in once in a while from the nurses, but I had no idea who his doctor was. I had no idea what was to expect. I didn't know if he was admitted. I didn't know if, what to expect. At 4 a.m. I left the ward after tending to my father. I left, and on my way home I was called by him to say that he was put off his bed. The bed that I made for him and set for him, he was put off he was put off the bed, and someone else was placed on his bed. I immediately went back to the hospital with another set of supplies for him and found him on another bed, lying cold straight. So we prepared that bed for him, leaving the other material on the bed with the patient they placed, and he was in a really calm state, so I remained calm for that moment. At around 8 that morning, I remember a group of doctors. At that point, I didn't know they were surgeons, but they came through the ward and they were checking patients. However, they stopped at a woman next to my father's bed and then left. At that point, I had no information from the nurses or doctors in the ward as to who was tending to my father or what we were waiting for. I consulted with the nurse and I asked, I said, was my father to be checked? What is happening? At that point, she told me that he was admitted, but there were no beds in the male ward upstairs. So I said, could there be a chance that he wasn't checked? She said, I don't know, ask his doctor. I said, who is his doctor? She couldn't answer. No one in the ward could tell me who was my father's doctor. However, at 3:30 or so that afternoon, all day, he was given painkillers. At 3:30 that afternoon, I spoke with a doctor, and she said he was now going to be taken up to the male's ward. I said, are you his doctor? Are you now looking at him? She said, yes. I got her name, and they took him up to the male ward. At that point, I was informed that I couldn't stay at the hospital because they had specific visiting hours, and I had to leave. I asked her, I said, you know, I was here all day, the day before, so I really need to have some time to go and come back so that I can make him comfortable. I left and I came back at around 5:30. When I returned, my father was lying there. He couldn't respond. He had a lisp. He couldn't move. His condition got worse. I noticed that his tummy was swelling and it had a strange, color to it. So I called the nurse immediately and I said, listen, my father's here and I think he's experiencing something that he hasn't before since he's been in the emergency room. And she checked his tummy and she confirmed that it was a bit strange and stiff. I said, could you call a doctor? She said, no, the doctors come the next morning at 9. I said, but he's in a condition where it could be fatal. It could be an emergency. She said, well, she can't do anything. She has to wait until the next morning when the doctors come through the ward. With that, I was told that I needed to leave the male surgical ward and because of the visiting hours. I left my father there and I, just out of instinct, I took 2 numbers of the patients sharing the room with him, 2 phone numbers. At 9 that night, I called to check on my father and he was in a deep sleep, one of the patients said, and I still couldn't understand what he was saying. They said he was getting saline. So with that, I went to bed. At 4 something that morning, I was called by a patient in that room, in my father's room, and this was exactly what he said to me. He said, girl, come down to this hospital, one of you need to come because for the last couple of hours we've been calling these nurses. Your father has been on the floor, hollering for pain, vomiting. I took my tube out, I went over to him and helped him back on the bed, but he's still hollering for pain. None of the nurses are coming. We're calling now. These nurses are just about a few yards away from this door. They can see in the room, so they must have heard these patients calling, and this was an account from 3 of the patients. So with that phone call, I left and I went to the hospital. I walked through. The security was sleeping. We went upstairs because at that point I was nervous. I wanted to know because he said that my father he wasn't moving. I think you guys should come because he's not moving. So we got into the ward, and where the ward is, you can stand at the corridor and you can see the door to the room, and you can see the nurses to your right. So I could have seen my father on his bed. As I entered that room, he was slunched over, hanging over, half of his body off of the bed, his head almost touching the floor. He had vomit through his mouth and nose. His eyes were opened. He was clutching the bed as if he was trying to raise himself back up. And he was stiff to touch and cold. At that point, you just knew it. He was stiff. I got startled and I ran out of the room. My sister was there with me, and she called for the nurses. At that point, none of the nurses were in the room. They did not come. The attendant that was there helped her. And then she said to us, she said, I cleaned this man's vomit 3 times. I came in here and I cleaned this man's vomit 3 times. On the 3rd time I called these nurses and none of them got up to help him. I myself cleaned it and I helped him. With that, well, I ran out at that point. I didn't know what else transpired, but my sister said that they raised him up and they tried to straighten him out and clean him up and put him nicely on the bed. At around 10 that morning, I proceeded to the complaints department and I made a detailed complaint about the scenario. But before that, when we were back up in the ward, attendant came to me and she said she's doing an investigation. Whenever someone dies in the room, she would come and she would do a prior investigation. She asked me questions about my father and then she proceeded to look for his medical chart. At that point, there was no chart for my father in that ward. She couldn't locate it. No one knew where it was. She wasn't the only one checking because we spoke to the head of the nurses there. She was looking for it as well. So when I went down to lodge my complaint, I told them about it. And I went to the several departments in the hospital looking for his chart. It was not found. For that entire day, I stayed at the hospital. I was back and forth because I knew that was going to be a very important piece, to understand what happened to my father, what was last given to him. On that morning, after I made the report, I was taken up to one of the ladies taking the report, called the doctor, and I was told who the doctor was. That was the only time that I knew who my father's doctor was. We went to speak with him. It was actually a group of men who I remembered being in that ward. And he said to me, so it was pancreatic cancer. So I said to him, he was never diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He said it's something very, very difficult to treat. And sometimes it can cause a lot of back pain. And I said, so what's next? Do we do a postmortem to find out what it is? And he said yes. So the postmortem was ordered, and we had requested to have an independent pathologist or someone neutral to the hospital to be present. But our request was never granted to us for some reason. But going back to the conversation with the doctor, he said that he turned to me and he said they checked him twice. I said, at what time did you check him? Because I was there with my father all the time. He said when he was there was another lady sitting with my father. At that stage, I became so upset. But I kept my calm because I knew there was going to be a time when he would have to prove that he and his colleagues did indeed check my father, and they did not, and they diagnosed him for pancreatic cancer. Now, I can say where that diagnosis would have come from because the prior examination, he did a test at a private hospital. We did an ultrasound that requested him to do a CT scan. The ultrasound said he had a mass on the head of his pancreas, but they needed to conduct a CT scan to decide whether it is cancer or not. That test result was given to the hospital on that Monday. And from that point, all I kept hearing, and they kept referring to my father as a cancer patient. And I kept saying he was never diagnosed with cancer. Can you guys do the CT scan? The CT scan has never been done on my father. I don't know what they treated him for. I don't know up to this day. We were told that in order to get a medical report, we would have had to send a lawyer's letter, and that was done. And we only received that report yesterday. Now, he died on the 9th, and we received it yesterday. We have full intention of going forward with a lawsuit against the hospital. We need accountability. I need to know what happened to my father. I need to know what he was treated for. I am pretty sure he was misdiagnosed because of how and what the doctors were telling me while I was there. And I need answers based on the postmortem that was done. There's no report on the postmortem. It was inconclusive. To this day, we do not have a death certificate. We were only given a paper or permission to bury him. My father is buried, and we're not resting. until we have answers. We're not resting until people are held accountable, and we're not resting until there is some sort of institutional change at that hospital, because we're not the only ones. We're not the only ones, but we're going to be the voice that will create a change, and I will not rest. Since my father's death, and I've spoken to my family, I said we needed time to mourn and to recover. So we have given the institution enough time to answer our concerns, to respond to the allegations or the concerns that we would have had based on his experience and my experience at the public hospital. Thus far, we've been getting a major pushback. People are feeling offended. We have asked to speak with the minister, and we're still waiting for a response on that. So I think we had given the Georgetown Public Hospital a fair chance to settle this matter and to give the family some sort of comfort in the fact that he was neglected and he died under their watch, or under their care. So it's been a journey that's been very hectic for us, and it's not simple when you're mourning the loss of a loved one. You don't have answers. To this day, we don't know what my father died with. We don't have a death certificate. They have taken samples of his organs, and they've told us that it takes about 6 weeks before they can get back to us regarding anything that's been found. We are waiting, and we need to have answers.
That's all we have for you. Until next time, this is Credible Sources.